with the kid, I'm just saying. And she said that it's only me who she asking.
Okay, thank you all for joining us today. Hello, good evening. My name is Hani. I'm here sort of wearing two hats at the same time. So I'm one of the 5 curators of the IABR. So this year's edition is The Nature of Hope, which is on display at the moment at Gallery 0. But I'm also a curator and moderator at Dépendance as well. First and foremost, I'd like to welcome you all, both new and familiar faces. This is a special occasion for us. I think across the whole, as I said, you'll find the Nature of Hope exhibition, which is part of 3 distinct elements that make up the 11th edition of the Architecture Biennale. But in this edition particularly, we, myself and 4 other curators were invited to think about the nature of hope specifically. In this, we were particularly thinking about the current ways the world of architecture and design play a part in addressing the climate and ecological crisis. We sought to use hope as a starting point, and that's reflected in the title. But for us, this was more a pragmatic notion rather than one that is rooted in pure idealism or naive optimism. So our exhibition, therefore, we believe, draws together practitioners that we fundamentally believe are already working at the forefront of the challenge of the climate crisis and often hand in hand with nature and ecology. So for us, the importance of foregrounding their work and platforming other ways of knowing, doing, and building was essential. So with all this in mind, and recognizing that we as designers, architects, planners, we do not exist solely in a vacuum, tonight's event looks out of the windows of the architecture office and into the windows of the mechanisms that dictate our everyday life. This is sort of the mechanisms of policymaking. It's important to acknowledge the roots of the problem and not just the symptoms. So for us, we think conversations around the necessary actions needed to limit climate change often seem to be articulated around different ways of arranging industry and science and technology to keep things as they are, to continue business as usual. But we're sort of locked in the inertia of what has come before. Perhaps most notable is the rise of green climate policies and agreements, often part or tied into this global Green New Deal movement. These policies begin to look at how climate action through law or policymaking can be a multi-pronged approach. In some ways, that's an interesting approach, right? It's using that as a way or a vehicle to instigate wider social change. And so it starts to not only question the notion of pollution and carbon, but also begins to think about the opportunity that these kinds of policies can present. But, and hopefully we'll answer this tonight, do these policies go far enough? So, to guide us through where we are now and where we need to go next, we'll be joined by Max Ajl. Max is author of Peoples and Green New Deal. I have a copy. I'll have to get it out after. But it's also on sale at the bookshop, so make sure you grab a copy. And we'll also be joined by Rosemarie van Ham from the Inclusive Climate Action Rotterdam and Ken de Koolman of BC Architects. Our discussion in the next hour and a half or so will look to chart out where we are and what we can do to inform meaningful policy changes that can make a real change when it comes to this current and ongoing climate and ecological crisis. Just a note on the structure, we'll start with a short presentation from both Max and Rosemarie before moving to a conversation between the two of them. We will then invite Ken de Koolman to join us on stage before finally opening up the floor to questions to you, our esteemed audience. So, I'm just going to quickly introduce Max before I invite him on to give us his presentation. So, Max is a fellow at the Marian Center for Advanced Studies in the Maghreb and at the University of Tunis. He's a senior fellow at the Department of Conflict and Development Studies at the University of Ghent and an associated researcher at the Observatory of Food Sovereignty and the Environment in Tunis. He has authored a People's Green New Deal and works on themes of political ecology. He's also an associate editor of Agrarian South, Journal of the Political Economy, and on the editorial board of Middle East Critique. So without further ado, Max, hand it over to you.
Hi, Thank you to the organizers for putting this together, and thank you to the attendees for taking some time out of your evening. I just flew over from New York, so I don't even know what day it is, but whatever day it is, thank you for coming. I'm going to talk about how we conceive of the world, right? Which sounds super grandiose. But what I'm going to argue is that how we conceive of the world affects how we insert ourselves into the world as people who want to change the world, right? And that it's important to unpack how different ways of seeing the world and what the political stakes are, right? And to clarify that often, there can be a tendency amongst progressives to be like, or some people would say, oh, progressives are always fighting about everything, or they're always being sectarian, or this or that, right? Or why isn't there unity? And I want to show, of course, everyone wants unity, but unity on what terms, right? And so it's a question of elaborating what is the basis of a principled unity. And what I tried to show is that things that seem like principled unities are actually illusory unities in that they often would end up being exclusive or non-inclusive, right? And that goes back to having accurate versus inaccurate understandings of the world in which we live. So this, I start with some comrade Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, with this little anecdote, which is notorious in that she says, how do I go, which way I ought to go from here? And the cat says, it depends where you want to go, right? Often we lack sufficient clarity in these types of discussions about where exactly we want to go, or it's assumed we want to go someplace good. We want to go to this utopia. We want to go to this kind of progressive, renewable place of sustainability and some sort of like Hobbiton or whatever. And it's like insufficiently clear that the exact parameters of where it is we want to go, right? So it's important both not only to have clarity about where we want to go, which I'm going to get to, or at least where I want to go, and like thereby own the stakes of where it is instead of presuming, right, that there's this shared consensus about where we want to go, but also to think about where we are. Because if you want to go somewhere specific, you have to start from somewhere specific. And in fact, there's many different places people start from, right? So I'm going to start by discussing the nature of our world, both how some people conceive of the world and also what I think is a more accurate map of how we can understand the world. And what I want to kind of do throughout the course of the presentation is clarify that there's literally existential stakes for clarity about what is the nature of our world, right? That actually it's one of the most important things to answer before engaging in principled action about how to change it. Right? So one argument, and I'm not actually going to delve that much into it, but I think this is kind of the grand sweep of kind of mainstream to very loosely progressive policy discourse, basically says that capitalism is the only possible world, right? Or and so who are the social agents who would change that world are the variety of what are called stakeholders, right? And you see this term a lot, they're stakeholders. Actually, stakeholders is a term that comes directly from the business literature and then entered forms of sustainability, social science, technocracy, green planning, and so forth. And it presumes kind of that everyone has a stake in the existing social order, everyone participates in the existing social order, and these are the people who should be at the table if you want to change the existing social order, right? That the stakes lead to different claims, and so everyone ends up kind of on the same footing, right? The corporations, they're stakeholders. Indigenous people, who are often in these reports, they're stakeholders. Workers are stakeholders. Historically marginalized groups are stakeholders. Community groups are stakeholders. Academics are stakeholders. And it's like, okay, well, in a sense, in a very limited sense, this is true, except corporations have a lot more power than workers. In fact, they exploit them to make money, right? I am not a stakeholder in the same way that Bill Gates is a stakeholder, right? He has like 700 trillion, quadrillion times as much money as I will ever have in my entire life. Like, we are not equivalent, right? Actually, Bill Gates relies on oppressing a lot of people in order to have that amount of resources. There's an antagonism at play, right? So I think essentially this idea of stakeholders leads to three possible paths, which are often represented very as radically distinct from one another, but I think have a lot of similarities, right? One is kind of this idea of northern industrial structuring. Here I'm using the US referent, which is the Biden plan. Biden may be not very present in the world that much, but his plan will definitely live on, whether or not Biden it continues to exist, or even if he exists now. Like, we kind of think he's a robot. But be that as it may, right? So there's like kind of these calls for northern industrial restructuring, like putting green development, green infrastructure in the north, greening the industrial production chain. This is kind of the basis of these, what I think are nascent arguments for a kind of industrial trade war with China. I think this is a very bad idea, obviously, but this is kind of the plan. Then there's kind of an allegedly more melioristic, softer, more pleasant plan, which is this idea of a northern Green New Deal, as was popularized by Ocasio-Cortez, calling for kind of anti-racism, talking about indigenous people also, talking about historically marginalized groups, but actually she still uses this language that corporations are some of the stakeholders, right? So it's actually not that different. Then there's someone who maybe you've heard of, I wasn't really sure, who's actually made quite waves in the European climate movement, who's actually Andreas Malm. He talks about like climate Leninism, these kind of like excitingly radical ideas, but and talks about violence. And violence is a tactic. I mean, violence isn't something that is radical in and of itself, is one thing. But what's actually called for in his work is a movement of movements to save the planet. He says this explicitly. So a movement of movements to save the planet assumes that the unity, of course, is saving the planet before you get to other types of oppressions, right? And this, for me, has a lot of problems, because what if people are facing more existential oppressions before they're facing the challenge of climate change, right? What if they're facing military aggression? Or what if they're facing the fact that they're facing starvation or slavery or so forth, right? There's all kinds of oppressions which could appear to people and are much more immediate than saving the climate. So this, again, is allegedly universal, right? It seems great. We're going to have a movement of movements to save the planet and stop global warming. But actually, it ends up being very particularistic, very parochial, in that it hides from view that other people may be facing other problems. So this is getting a bit more specific. This is getting into the approaches that are actually critical of capitalism, but here I argue that it depends how we are critical of capitalism, right? So one analysis basically says that development in the world is not polarized. Capitalism is flat. It looks the same everywhere. You have bosses and you have workers. It looks the same in Brazil, it looks the same in Botswana, and it looks the same in Boston, right? That's the argument. Now, I think that's just ridiculous, actually. Like you don't have 40% unemployment rates in Boston, and you don't have them in Amsterdam, and you do have them in South Africa, right? And you do have 40% now, almost 40% unemployment in like Tunisia. You have close to over 40% of people in what's called the informal sector in the entire tricontinental arena in Latin America, Africa, and all of Asia, with the exception of extreme East Asia and China, right? So it's very polarized, whereas you have a different type of occupational structure in the north, as well as very low unemployment, right? And you also have much higher wages, right? So what that leads us to understand is that development is actually polarized. It's not just polarized between workers and capitalists within countries, it's also polarized between countries, right? And we see this. There's not worldwide income convergence. It's never happened, right? Actually, you see the rising disparities between countries, right? It's extremely well established in the social science. So why is that the case, right? Well, some people would be like, well, the third world just doesn't know how to develop. Okay, again, like this is crazy to me, right? Everyone can figure out, if they're not stopped, how to develop their countries. There have to be obstacles, right? So what I think is important to bring to the climate conversation is imperialism, right? You don't have to read through these big blocks of texts, but basically it means that stronger nation states are controlling weaker nation states, economically, politically, and so forth, right? And this manifests and ecologically on many levels that are incredibly important, right? The concept that's often used is something called ecologically unequal exchange, but it basically means that people in the poorer countries have a much greater exposure to natural disasters. I mean, you heard about what happened to the earthquake in Haiti and the hurricane in Puerto Rico and the typhoon in Mozambique, right? This is because there's less developed infrastructures, and it's also because there's a higher incidence of so-called natural disasters, but they pass through infrastructures, and those infrastructures are underdeveloped in the third world. It's notable, in fact, that in Cuba, nobody dies of hurricanes, right? So it's also how is social power organized? Is it organized to protect lives, or is it organized, or is it not capable of being organized to protect lives? You also have, in the third world, a much greater exposure to environmental toxins, for example, pesticides. European industrial waste is actually shipped to Turkey from the EU, right? It's systematic. Pesticides that are illegal to use in the EU are used in Tunisia. They're actually banned here and they're sent there, right? So people are actually dying of cancer at accelerated rates. So you have systematically worse health outcomes. Deforestation is much more prevalent, again, in the third world as compared to Europe or the United States or even China, which are actually reforesting, right? So you have clear different exposures to ecological degradation, many of which are connected to global warming, right? These natural disasters are connected to global warming, for example, right? And that includes actually the whole models that are used for global warming in terms of how many people will die, how many will suffer. If you look at something, they actually assign a different value to lives in the South and in the North. And that's why these modelers will be like, well, it's not going to affect GDP that much. That's because they literally devalue, their models literally devalue lives in the South, right? What's important to keep in mind, actually, I gave this presentation last time in Belgium because I thought it's worthwhile reminding the Belgian folk, like, what the history of Belgium a little bit. But you guys have history too, right? We all do. Don't worry. But it's important to keep in mind, right, that these are not just flows that are happening in the abstract, and it's not like there's this kind of abstract process going on. It's happening in history, right? It's happening historically, and it's happening even now, right? These are happening through concrete historical acts, right? I mean, and this is like Belgium returns Lumumba's tooth to the family after he was dissolved in acid, right? I mean, this is why Congo continues to be in a very bad situation, right? Is because they were never allowed to even start their own independence properly, right? And France supports ECOWAS intervention into Niger, and this was like a year or two. Why is France allowed to go into Niger, right? I mean, no one's allowed to come here to like decide who's the president, right? I mean, in America, no one even votes, right? No one decides, right? It's like we have 41% participation in the political process. So it's crazy, right? But this is understood as normal, right? And in some cases, it's very extreme, right? I mean, you have a place on this planet right now where people are suffering from polio, massive greenhouse gases through militarized emissions, land theft, destruction of the earth, right? Near universal unemployment is like 90%, and that's Palestine, which is suffering under a genocide right now in the face of a heroic resistance against it, right? So this is happening right now, right? And in fact, the arms trade, EU is connected through trades and arms deals right now. So there's a complicity, which is not meant to be like boo-hoo, we should feel sad about it. We should understand that if we don't want this type of world, that requires us to actually do something about it, right? And not forget about it. Not brush it under the carpet and not say, okay, well, we need to deal with climate change first, and then we'll deal with this other thing. Well, people are over there dying right now, right? Like, they can't wait until 20 years and we have a green infrastructure and then we deal with all these other issues. That's not a just way to build a unity, right? That's my point. So now this is where I get to the kind of more positive aspects. Where do we want to go? And really, where do we want to go? It's like where I think we should go, right? It's not we. And you guys can sign on or not. I hope I convince you. But it's where might one want to go if one wanted a very different, like decommodified world where people had access to a decent life on a worldwide basis, right? Eco-socialism, meaning like the worldwide decommodification, meaning you don't need, you have guaranteed, the means of production are publicly owned, right? Which some things used to be publicly owned here. I learned that you guys have been like privatizing your railroads and stuff. It's ridiculous. But in fact, the basic means of production, in my opinion, should be publicly owned and publicly managed, right? You should have more or less permanently sustainable patterns of production. This doesn't mean like everybody should just be, chopping down trees and making implements about it. That's why you have more or less permanently sustainable. Everyone still wants an industrialized world, but how industrialized, how to make industry softer in its impact, these are serious questions, right, that we should discuss. You have worldwide developmental convergence. That might be jargon. What that means is that everybody should basically have what we now identify as the same income, more or less, like within reason. Okay, there can be some differences. It's not a big deal, but it shouldn't be that GDP per capita in Yemen is like $1,400 and GDP per capita in the United States is like $80,000, right? Like that means that people there are often enduring famine, right? Because they don't have enough social power represented in GDP per capita to access what's produced in the world, right? So that also means equal per capita access to energy, right? A lot of these climate models, right, including stuff that's put out by people like Robert Powell, and if you know the name, will say, will actually smuggle in the assumption that some countries, like Haiti, for example, do not deserve the same level of per capita access to energy as countries like Australia or America, right? I think that's actually a very problematic perspective, right, from a justice perspective. And then equal labor distribution on a world scale, like labor should be divided equally. I mean, it doesn't mean if someone is like deeply disabled, they have to work. That's not what it means at all, but it does mean that, people should not be pulling 80-hour weeks in some parts of the world and people just chilling in other parts of the world. Like everyone should be participating in the labor process, right? Now, there's a political, so what does this mean? I mean, what it means is you have to then think about how do you get there, right? Because it's very complicated to get there, and you need some sort of theory. Now, to go back, the flat capitalism, where capitalism kind of looks the same everywhere, says that northern workers are kind of the leading class. That should be the main class that leads a transition, right? Which is kind of attractive to a lot of people. They're like, okay, northern workers in like solar factories and in green hydrogen factories and what have you, and producing sustainable Teslas will be the ones to lead a green transition, right? The problem is, of course, that these are not the most oppressed people in the world. And it's normal that if you exclude from consideration the political leadership of the most oppressed people, you're not going to have an inclusive outcome. If you want an inclusive outcome, and we know this from like feminism and anti-racism, that if you want an inclusive outcome, you probably want to adopt or at least accommodate the perspective of those who are most excluded from the world we currently live in, right? It's logical. And then you have a different class that's kind of, that would lead, right? You have, and it doesn't mean people in different places, everyone has a role, but it's like how lead, meaning offer political leadership to a transition, right? And then you would have peasants, who are still a huge portion of the population in South Asia and Africa. You would have peripheral industrial labor, that is like people working in like textile factories in Bangladesh who actually see them collapse upon them because they don't have adequate labor and safety protection. Meanwhile, Bangladesh is suffering devastating floods. Like their programs need to take the lead, right? Third world working class women. I mean, in a large portions of Africa, women are actually, the unwaged women are actually engaging in the direct production of the things people need for their survival, like cooking fuel, food, clothing, right? Their voices, their program needs to be included, right? The indigenous people are often the poorest people in the entire world system, right? This would be the leading class, and then often, because these people are concentrated in the third world, then you have a national question. They have to liberate their nations from imperialism, and then this is the transition to a just and sustainable world system, or eco-socialism, right? Then I'm getting to the last couple slides. I mean, the struggle looks different depending on where you are, right? In the north, we have a decommodification, that is the public ownership of necessary services like railways, energy, but also agriculture. Improvements in quality and the ecological lightening of health, infrastructure, consumer goods, agriculture, energy. I think other people are going to talk about this more, but it's very clear that there's a lot of technology available to do this. If it's agroecology in the agricultural sector, if it's sustainable building materials, if it's a total shift to public transport, if it's a shift away from intervention-intensive medicine to preventative medicine, you actually get far lower emissions by an order of magnitude through preventative as opposed to reactive medicine, for example, right? But it also means thinking about how the North is actually messing up the South, right? Which is something we can't sidestep. Building a better society at home also means understanding how you're not allowing other people to build better societies, right? So that's one, anti-imperialism, which means very simply respecting that other countries have the right of self-determination over how their political future would look like. Second, it means demilitarization, especially the US, but also the EU. And it also means paying climate debt, that is, reparations for all the harms that have been caused over the last 200 years by the northern system of power, right? The southern face of the struggle is sovereign industrialization, that is an industrial system that people in the South control, right? Not reliant so much on northern technology. That means agrarian reform, breaking up the largest states, which is endemic in the third world, and is actually the basis of a sustainable development strategy. The only country that's done it successfully over the last 40 years is Zimbabwe, and they face sanctions that have destroyed the currency, savagely destabilized the country, right? Why? Just because they did an agrarian reform, because they took land from wealthy white people and gave it to poor black people, and then they were punished by the US and the EU for it. And it's not even known, right? No one even knows that this happened. Right? And then kind of overall national liberation, that is taking control over your productive forces and putting them under sovereign economic control within the country. And then ecological planning. So basically, I know there's a lot of talk about degrowth. I actually think it's super simple. Some things grow, other things degrow, right? And then finally, I actually think that sometimes young people, because they don't have to worry about getting fired from jobs and stuff, and like they can speak their conscience and so forth, can speak very freely, and we shouldn't treat them as these kind of like cute creatures who say these things. That's cute, and we like pat their heads, and then we go back to like our cynical lives. No, we could actually listen to them. Greta Thunberg. Let us listen to what she says, right? She's also a big supporter of Palestine, don't forget it. But she said, in a system defined by colonialism, imperialism, oppression, and genocide by the so-called global north to accumulate wealth that still shapes our current world order, she says we should change that, right? So I hope I've convinced at least one of you who didn't think that before, that should be on the agenda. And thank you so much.
Thanks. Oh, I don't need that, it's fine. Thank you for that presentation, Max. So next, I would like to welcome Rosemarie van Ham to take to the stage and give us a short introduction. So Rosemarie is a civil servant currently working for the municipality of Rotterdam. She founded Inclusive Climate Action Rotterdam, ICAR, with a mission to advocate climate justice and equality. ICAR works on a sustainable and climate just future for all Rotterdammers, based on equality and inclusion, by giving marginalized groups a stage and bringing the social and the physical domain together. Rosemarie is a strong defender of the right to a healthy life for all, and her work seeks to challenge the typical way we think about climate action and climate change and contribute to climate justice. Rosemarie?
Is it working? Yes, it's working. I'm also going to walk and just start with my story. First of all, I want to thank Max for your book, for your research. I'm going to give you a little response of 2 slides. Don't be angry. I hope you like it. And then I'm going to tell something about Inclusive Climate Action Rotterdam, ICAR, what we are doing in our city. So, a little response. For me, when I was reading the book, it was daring, it was addressing systematic problems. But also for me, sometimes, I'm not a researcher, I did a master's degree, but still, sometimes it was challenging for me to understand these methodologies. So for me, it's also like, how are you going to translate maybe for marginalized group, also to make it more readable for people? Also, during the reading, I had a lot of emotions. I had a lot of feelings of sadness, anger, discomfort, but also despair about the system structures that are existing. Sometimes I knew already what was happening, but sometimes you put it away and go with your life. But if you read it, then you know, shit, it's really happening. But also, everything revolves on money. Even in the Dutch government, we have the ministry now based on climate policy, but it's connected with green growth, we call it. So it's still tied with economic reasons. And I think I think 4 years ago, it was the Ministry of Climate Policy and Economics. So you can fill it in by yourself. But also the book activated me to understand the agreements that you were talking about of people, the methodologies, to have an other understanding. We agree with it that it's important to recognize the global inequality and the structural issues, but also to understand the pain points that are happening before you're seeking solutions with the things that you are doing. It's really important to understand this inequality, these structures on national level, on international level, but also on city level. So for example, for us, what does it mean for Rotterdam? I'm going to tell you later. And it's also interesting to focus on civil servants that already work on climate justice and support them and make a group movement inside of the government. What we are saying is that climate adaptation or mitigation must go hand in hand to tackle inequalities in our city or in general in the world, and you need an inclusive and intersectional approach, and that's what we did with ICAR. So we always start our presentation, Rotterdam, how do we look at our city and what do you see? Because everyone has their own perspective. This is Rotterdam. We have a lot of architecture, we have a lot of greening in the area, we have a lot of space, but this is a little bit city marketing because we want to show the world that we have an amazing city. But in reality, this is also our city that we don't talk about a lot. Homeless people, that are dispersed from their houses, that cannot pay their rent anymore, or big streets with a lot of pavement and no green. Why are we saying this? Is Rotterdam has different faces and different people. I don't know who's happy, who's healthy or independent, but we know there are a big difference in our city. Because we're the poorest cities in the Netherlands, but we're also the unhealthiest city in the Netherlands. Above that, we get climate change. So we have this Rotterdam Weatherwise program, which is the climate adaptation program of the municipality of Rotterdam. And it focuses on 6 climate themes like heavy rain, groundwater, heat, flood, drought, and land subsidence. But it's mainly focused on the technical solutions and the technical issues that we have. But in the middle, you also have some people, because we also have a neighborhood approach to do together with citizens some greening in the area, for example. But what we are saying is climate change is also a health crisis. For example, we had the last climate march in Rotterdam. In front of the climate march, we had the banner with white supremacy kills people and climate. There were indigenous people that saying like, hey, you need to listen to this. And even our colleagues from the health department on the right, they were walking there with a banner like the climate crisis is a health crisis, so we have to do something about it. Climate change also increases inequalities. What we are saying is climate inequality is also a power inequality. Josephine van Heel from the University of Antwerp did a research about this, and she is saying like, okay, different social inequalities such as income, wealth, gender, ethnicity comes together as layers on top of each other. If you want to break this, you have to understand the structures of the system, but also you have to understand the perspective of those people. You need to involve them. We have people in the city that stand up, use their voices. They don't agree with the things that we do. So we have the Black Lives Matter movement, we have the Air Pride movement, for example, we have the Fair Pay House movement, we have the accused of tax fraud, of the children daycares movement. So people will use their voices. And this is the difficult thing that we were starting, like, okay, we have this climate crisis and we have this social inequalities and this social crisis. How are we going to convince our civil servants into, or our policymakers or people in the city? So we designed this ICAR climate wheel. It's based on the method of Sylvia Duckworth. We asked her permission if we could use it, translate it in English, but for today it's in Dutch again. And what we did research based on every category. Yeah, this. On every category here, but also we talked with people expert by experience. So can we use the word, what does it mean for you? And what we did, we were very creative. We put the 6 climate themes around the wheel. So how does it work? How more you go into the inside, because you can fill it in for yourself for a project or an area or whatever, just to get more awareness. How more you go to the inside, how more privilege you have based on the system that we are living in and the norms that we have. How more you're on the outside, how more you get marginalized in this society. So how do we use this? For example, in Rotterdam, they are saying we want to be climate proof. 40% of the area is public space, 60% of the area is private space. So we need people with their house to make it climate proof. For example, you can do these solar panels, these green roofs, greening, double glass, etc. So if you go to housing, if you're homeless, you're excluded already. You know, there's no house, you can do nothing. If you rent, for example, like me, I rent a house in Rotterdam. If I want to have double glass, I need to pay every month more rent for that. Or if you are renting by social housing, then you need to ask permission, and maybe you're on the planning of maintenance the next 4 years. If you own a property, then the Rotterdam law is saying that's your own responsibility. You have to invest in that. But if you make an intersection, like, okay, if you own a property and you have a low income, because we have people in this situation in Rotterdam, how are you going to do that? So the government's saying, okay, we're going to help you. We give you a subsidize with money so you can do some solar panels, greening, and make your house climate proof. But first you have to pay it by yourself, and after that we pay the money back. Then you exclude those people. But also we have other questions based on the policy that we have. For example, we have heat wave program, and during a heat wave we have a heat plan that is mainly focused on vulnerable groups like pregnant people, elderlies, and children. That's a good thing because it's a vulnerable group. But what we are saying with ICAR is, okay, if you look at neurodiversity, people with ADHD, for example, that taking medicines have a higher risk of overheating. Or people that have autism, it's very difficult for them to get a new routine or to say, I have it warm, I need to drink. So who is for them? But also trans people that working wearing binders during the heat have a higher risk to have overheating. And this is a thing to think differently. So for us, the values is very important. We have to look at the social exclusion and discrimination in your city. So that means, what kind of access do I have at networks or subsidizes? Do I trust the government? Do I trust the society? Am I being discriminated in this city? Information, how do we inform Rotterdammers? For example, in our policy, you have to inform in Dutch, which is maybe weird because we have 178 nationalities, but also do we trust the message? Sometimes the government gives free plants to neighborhoods, and then you need to sign a paper with our logo of the government, and then people say, no, I don't want to do that because we don't trust this based on some things that happened. And also the impact. What is the impact of heat or humanity on a person's health? What if I have asthmatic? How are we going to do that? But also, what is your action perspective? Am I physically, mentally, financially able to take action? Can I choose where I live? Can I choose where I work in this city? And those are a lot of questions that we have just to show people think differently. Because what you see is policymakers are mainly sitting in here, and we make policy on the outsider ring. So there's a big gap missing. A quick one. What we are saying is every Rotterdammer has the right to a healthy life. Climate change is increasing the inequalities in Rotterdam. That's unnecessary, and that we don't want to do. And also we want to make the existing system more fair, and we want to make a kind of a movement, a climate justice movement, to help people to share knowledge and to give them a space on the table of the policy making. Few things that we are doing now. This is a research together with Davina Misijan. She's a professor in human rights and the environment. She's doing a research based on the law that we have on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And one of the things she is doing for us, like what is the space of a government where we can invest unequal to get equal opportunities in our city, because if you find it out in the law, then you have more space to do the things and do the right things also. Also, we're doing this Interreg program or project, you could call it, about just green policy. This is a 4-year project with other cities. And in this project, we want to make our green policy more just. So we asked the green agenda, did you figure out like the green that you added the last 4 years, which is 20 acres, how did it add it to the inequality of the city? And first they were saying, no, we're not going to do that. But we explain them, if you find out in which way it added to the inequalities that you have in the city, then you can only improve your policy for the future. And now they agreed, and we're working on that together. We also did with Hani Salih, our colleague and friend, a research about climate and refugees. First of all, to have the stigma based on refugees, because if you were talking about refugees, everyone was thinking about Ukraine, but there's like a story about this. There's more happening in the world. And she collected the stories of them, just to listen to them, what happened, but also to understand what they already did in their countries based on their cultures with climate solutions. And even a few of those solutions were edited in our climate policy. And also we worked with indigenous perspective. For example, this is Chautuleo Tranamil. She helps us. We work together also on policy, but also she's doing awareness sessions for our government people, and she gives lectures on the relationship between themes like decolonization, climate justice, indigenous culture, and biodiversity. And she talks also about the indigenous genocide that still is going on these days. This is a case with neurodiversity. We talk with neurodiverse persons. What does it mean for them if climate change is happening now? What kind of changes, what kind of feelings do they have, and how can we implement it for policy? This is the last one. We're making a movie. I cannot show it to you because in 2 weeks it will come out. This is storytelling based on climate justice, where rather than people talk about what really is happening in the city, and on the left you see Yanni, and she is saying, for example, no place has equal opportunities for everyone, so it's not there. And on the right, does somebody knows what it is on the right? Yeah? Yes. Martin was talking about the Teslas. They need to go out of the city of Rotterdam because of this reason. I want to finish with a quote of Chico Mendes. He is saying, environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening. Thank you very much for listening. And I have a QR code to follow us on LinkedIn.
Thank you for that presentation. I think I'd like to now invite Max and Rosemarie to join me on stage. This is the book, for anyone who's so inclined. It's available for sale by NIE booksellers. Okay, so I'm just going to put this up like this. It's a good book. Thank you both for those presentations. It's really interesting to sort of situate the thinking that you're both doing. I think, Max, your thinking is a sort of the bigger picture, trying to really situate the global systems, infrastructures, and institutions that are really perpetuating or continuing these kind of cycles of extraction, almost kind of the new forms of colonialism, as it were. And I think what I thought was really interesting in your book was the way in which you kind of, your critique of climate action was almost one of accusing climate action to be ahistorical in some way, right? It does not necessarily factor in the histories that actually led to the structures of extraction that we have today. So with that being said, I thought it would be quite interesting to get, because I want to move to your in the book you speak specifically about ecological debt, which you've touched upon there, but you also talk a little bit about you have a critique of Green New Deal movement as a whole. And I wanted to maybe start there. Perhaps we start with the AOC notion of Green New Deal, if you tell us a little bit more about that, and then tell us the ways in which, essentially, as you described in the book, it doesn't necessarily go as far enough.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I think those are super important points to raise. So the AOC Green New Deal was painted as a very transformative program for changing America and therefore changing the world, right? Now, it posed, I think, two problems, or contained within it two central gaps, both what it said and what was left unsaid, right? In terms of the trickier thing, what is left unsaid? I mean, someone can be like, it doesn't need to touch upon everything. That's true, maybe it doesn't need to touch upon everything, but it needs to touch on some central things, right? Now, if you want to do a Green New Deal in America, you have to say, what is America? And if you want to do a Green New Deal, what is America doing that should or shouldn't go green? And also, what is America doing that shouldn't be done at all, whether it's green or not, right? If you want to wall those things off, that's a normative or that's a political choice, right? And that's what I was trying to pose in the book, is that that's a decision, right? It's a decision to say that the military should continue to exist, even though it's a major polluter, even though it causes harm to a lot of people on the planet, even though it's not necessary in order to have good lives for everybody on the planet, for the US to have a military, right? It's a choice to not address the military, which even on the very narrow terms of carbon emissions is a major polluter, right? It would also be a choice, like Senator Elizabeth Warren, at the time a major political figure in the US, to call for greening the US military. That's also a choice, right? I think that depoliticizes what the US military is, but that's also a choice. But it's also another choice just to completely ignore it and say, well, that's not something we want to do. And then there is a problem then when a program that avoids this central pillar of injustice in the world is painted as a deeply transformative program, right? Then what we think of as transformative is actually kind of warped. We're forgetting, in a way, that there's a central plank in which it's very much status quo, right? The other thing is that the language it uses when it talks about power relationships is, I think, very elusive. For example, the Green New Deal talked about both oppressed frontline communities and historically marginalized groups. But you know, as I think both of us were presenting on, one powerful way people are marginalized is their relationship to economic power, right? And it didn't really talk about redressing that, and it didn't really talk about transforming that. Instead, it swept it very much under the table, all the while being branded as this extremely transformative proposal. I mean, the third aspect, which I think is incredibly important, is that in creating this as the most transformative proposal, which a lot of publications did, maybe you guys know Jacobin magazine, for example, which probably some of you have heard of, called it like an eco-socialist proposal. Okay, well, it's not the first time someone put forward a proposal identified as eco-socialist in our world, right, at all. And this is what I was also doing in the book, is I was kind of excavating another proposal that was put forward in 2010, but not in the US Congress, and not by a congresswoman from New York City, from the most powerful city in the most powerful country in like the history of the whole world, but instead from like marginalized people in Latin America, the Cochabamba People's Agreement, where amongst other things, right, one of the central planks was a call for reparations for the climate debt that is the illegitimate use of the world's extra space for carbon dioxide emissions, which in principle should be a common property of humanity, right? It was actually used entirely by the North, right? Maybe some of you have heard, you hear about China emitting a lot. On a per capita basis, China is basically just barely over what it would be allowed if carbon emitting rights, were distributed equally on a per capita basis, right? Which is crazy, right? Compared to what you hear about China and the EU and the US. In fact, China just hasn't used that much world atmospheric space. So the countries that really have to pay carbon reparations, ecological debt, right? Which is a demand that started emerging even in the late 1980s in Latin America, from Colombia and Cuba. The demand, it was for these payments, and it was the countries that have to pay are basically Japan, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, United States, and Canada, right? So again, what I wanted to bring out in both the book and also the presentation I gave is that the decision to ignore something, and a very important policy proposal, a very important product of social movements, is a political decision. And what's important is that one takes ownership of what is mentioned and also what is left silent. And it's understood that these are, it's a decision to voice something, and it's a decision to not voice it, right?
Yeah. And actually, I think what would be a good point to follow up on that, from your book, it felt like, I mean, you've said this a couple of times, is actually, you kind of outlined that one of the main barriers to meaningful action against climate change is essentially political or sociological rather than technical. I think there's a quote in here where you say, the obstacle, this is just from the chapter on the beginning of your sort of proposition. You say, the obstacle to worldwide worldwide universal healthcare is not technological, it's social. It demands a social revolution to shatter the capitalist organization of healthcare and to restructure it as a primary care-centered, preventative, and decentralized. And I know that you do this, obviously that's an example from healthcare, but it's one that you talk about when you talk about agriculture, for example, or even transport, and even the sort of architecture in the built environment as well. So in that sense, I want to get your perspective on that, but also, Rosemarie, I want to ask you around the particular barriers that you found in carving out the space for ICAR within, the municipality, like if you can talk about that. But in that sense of, what are it's not necessarily about ideas of being particularly stuck, but what are the institutional barriers in place? What are the
first of all,
technocratic
to start, there was no politician that asked for climate justice. We just started it because for us it was really important to think about these inequalities that we have in the city. Is it fair? Has everyone the same start or equal opportunities in it? And what we see now, people have a lot of blind spots, and people sometimes don't want to know what's really happening in the world. So we're taking time for that to make people more aware in our city government, to help them to understand that this is the story that's happening on national level, international level, but also on city level. And to get a better understanding, we're trying to find a lot of data, because data works for politicians also to make decisions. And also we're trying to help to tell civil servants like we are also responsible for making policy, to give good advices to politicians, or say we don't agree and we have maybe other solutions in that way. The most difficult part for us is that I think every organization has there's a structure in it, and sometimes, that it makes it more difficult.
Yeah.
But at the end, that's why we're saying we try to make a movement. We're trying to make people are standing up also outside to say that we need to work on climate justice. So that also gives a lot of support. But it takes a lot of time. We're now working already, I think, 4 or 5 years. And it was a lot of awareness, but a lot of fights also. But I think it's getting slower and better.
Yeah.
So we know what we are doing.
Yeah. And Max, you've kind of referenced eco-socialism in your presentation and even just then in your answer. I'm wondering if you could, because you've got some really interesting examples in the book, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what a vision for an eco-socialist world looks like. What are some of the things that you've outlined in the book? What does that look like? And also, if you could, in a sense, also react to this notion of what people might perceive to be green austerity that you also talk about in the book.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll talk about that by referring back to the healthcare sector, right? And I'm from America. America, of course, has like a uniquely barbaric healthcare sector, right? It has the highest percentage of GDP goes to healthcare spending, or at least the highest spending, certainly the highest spending per person. And in the OECD, it has some of the worst health outcomes, especially per dollar spent, it has the worst health outcomes, right? And there's also very emissions-intensive health technology, right? I think it's around 10% of U.S. emissions are attributable to the healthcare sector. Now, of course, this is because the drug industry and the health insurance industry would absolutely profit a great deal from the current organization of the medical system, of the healthcare system. They would never accept for it to be made into a public utility. And the rest of them, the rest of the sectors, like the banks, say, or the car manufacturers, they understand that they need to stand by the insurance industry, and they need to stand by the pharmaceutical industry, because they don't want anyone coming for them and being like, let's actually nationalize you too. Let's turn car manufacturing into a public utility, right? It's common sense. Like, you need to stand with your buddies when they're being attacked, right? So there's this power block that prevents, which is like the nature of organizing social power under capitalism, that prevents both the popular control and then the popular restructuring of those industries. Now, there's specific technical reasons this actually leads to ridiculously bad outcomes, right? For example, primary care doctors are paid less than specialists in the U.S. healthcare system, right? But actually, if you want to prevent as opposed to treat an illness, that's the role of primary care doctors. Right, who are going to head something off before it happens, which is 40% giving like adequate nutrition counseling and so forth, and seeing a small problem before it becomes a big problem, right? And this kind of primary care-centered healthcare system, where doctors are actually regularly paying house calls and are aware of the kind of social life, social biography of the individuals who they're treating. This is the Cuban healthcare system, right? It's preventative as opposed to reactive, right? A reactive healthcare system, however, is very profitable, right? And a technology-intensive healthcare system is very profitable for the people, the pharmaceutical industry, the medical technology industry, who are designing and profiting from these tech-heavy interventions, right? Be it, cancer treatments, or be it MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging, right? Or be it obesity treatments, right? Which is actually very much related to people having nutrition problems and being fed inadequately early in life, and then develop these imbalances, and also related to the subsidy of unhealthy foods within the U.S. agricultural system. For example, the subsidy of corn, which then turns into corn syrup, which then goes into like every single food in the U.S. grocery shelf, right? Or it also is related to kind of, if you to go back to the MRI, an actually well-trained orthopedist doesn't need to do an MRI to understand if your knee is damaged. This is actually something that's more or less been encouraged. They're encouraged to do, and then there's kind of conspiracy of profit, and also, of course, manufacturing and using the MRI is extremely emissions intensive. So you get not only you get usually worse healthcare outcomes and you pay a lot more money. And so this is just an example. If you put the healthcare system, you remove the profit incentive, right? You put healthcare, and keeping in mind that all the R&D for drugs and the basic research for all the technology in healthcare is publicly funded. I mean, this is funded through the US university system, the National Institutes of Health, and so forth, right? So if you put all of this under public control, but also not just public control with one dude at the top of the state, but you put it under a democratic popular control, through the state, but also under popular control, and it's decentralized, you would have better healthcare outcomes, right? And you would get emissions far lower. You could probably get them not to zero, because you want some technology, but closer to zero. And you would spend less social resources on such a healthcare system, right? You would also make sure, I know this is like foreign to you guys, for the US, it would be by making healthcare a social right. Like everybody would have free access to healthcare just because they are in US borders, right? Which is not currently the case, right? These are the types of transformations that fall under an eco-socialist transformation. Healthcare no longer a commodity, something you buy and sell on the market. Instead, it's a social right, which is guaranteed by the state, right? This is one example. I mean, I don't want to, I'm not sure about our time here, so I can like belabor this for other sectors too, which I have researched in the book. Like maybe we can circle back to like agriculture and building technology a little bit. But in all sectors, right, the technology basically exists for qualitatively improved equivalent or improved outcomes than what we have right now, right? In all the countries of the North, really, be it healthcare, be it agriculture, be it building technology, be it infrastructure, be it transports, right? The technologies exist now, keeping in mind that there's been basically no research and development into these technologies, because the research and development is actually in emissions intensive and capital technologies. But even now, technology basically exists to make all of these sectors low carbon or close to carbon neutral, particularly in agriculture, right? And improve qualitatively the outcomes. The problem is that this would run into the friction of the profit motive, and that's why they're not being implemented, and that's why you can't really allow the profit motive to decide the quality and level of access to goods we need as human beings for our day-to-day well-being.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite sobering when you realize the tools are already there. We just need to get to them. Yeah. I think it would be possibly we should introduce Ken. So Ken, I'd like to invite you to join us. Ken is, sorry, I just need to find the card. Yeah. So Ken de Koeman is the co-founder of BC Architects. BC Architects studies and materials, and he's a research associate at the Active Building Junior Professorship at RWTH Aachen. Sorry if I butchered that. Sorry. He holds a master's in philosophy and architecture and a candidate in psychology. Starting a trajectory as an architect, Ken de Koeman focused on earth construction with several projects on the European and African continent. Today, Ken is directing BC Materials with a focus on R&D of geo, bio, and urban source materials. And also, Ken and BC Architects are in the Nature of Health exhibition too. So, Ken, if you could just tell us a little bit about your work and how it sits within.
Okay. Is this one on? Or
I don't think it's on.
Yet? Okay. Oh, I hear that now it's on. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It has been super interesting to listen to you. I think my angle or my entry will come a bit from practice. Practicing as an architectural practice, going into other things like material production and education and so on. And yeah, so I think maybe first to explain what BC is. BC is it stands for Brussels Cooperation. It's actually 3 entities at the moment. It's BC Architects, BC Studies, and BC Materials. And so the fact that we have to have 3 legal entities to do what we feel that has to be done in our sector points already to some issues within our sector. So BC Architects is, let's say, a normal architectural office which designs and supervises the construction of buildings. BC Studies is an organization that kind of organizes education. We're doing a postgraduate in some universities in Belgium. We have the chair in Aachen. And BC Materials is a material production company that in fact produces earth building materials such as clay plaster, earth blocks and so on, made from the excavated earths from our cities, in our case from Brussels in fact. So, you know, whenever big construction sites happen, the underground parking is dug out and there's like this huge amount of actually very good geological material which is legally considered as a waste. And so we have an environmental permit to transform this waste into building products that can be used in the construction industry. So that has grown, of course. It's not suddenly that this came to be, and it has grown from, in fact, being or practicing as an architect, and kind of not being okay with the limits of what our profession could do or was meant or was seen to have to be done in Belgium. So that as an architect you have to draw on paper, you have to write a book, the specifications, and you have to give it to the contractor, and you have to point your finger to the contractor when things go well or go wrong, and so on. And so that this seemed to be very limiting with regards to the challenges that we were thinking we were up to. And so we kind of from the start, we didn't have a lot of experience in other offices. From the start, we kind of had a different approach in legal gray zones, I also have to say, because it was actually not totally allowed in Belgium, where we, in fact, from the start, we were working together with the builders, learning together, organizing workshops around materials such as earth, fibers, and so on, how to mix them, what can we do with them in a local, let's say, area around the project. So like they're kind of small scale projects, so it was really manageable. And so from there, like being together, venturing together, learning together with different actors made it possible to do this kind of first time projects that have never been done yet in Belgium, or at the time also in Netherlands. For example, like the first hempcrete public building was done in this kind of gray zone, illegal way. It's interesting that it's a public building, but also interesting that this was actually illegally came into existence. The first public earth building also was done this way. And so all this kind of first timers, let's say, because of this total like putting upside down of processes of design and construction. And so I think so what we're talking about here tonight, what I've heard a lot is like over the years, you know, like by reading and learning a lot, I have come to try and also capture the bigger point about, you know, the system changes that are needed. In the beginning, we were kind of young and we just came from university, let's say, and just immediately starting doing this. We didn't really know yet. It was also already like 2012 or something. We didn't really know or understand yet all of these systemic structures that were going on. But however, the intuition was that something was not okay how we did it, and we wanted to learn and create the environment for ourselves and others to do it in a different way. And so here we are in like 2024, and we have discovered some ways that work for us as a practice, and of course it's also always still evolving, and it's like a project that goes on. And so if I listen to the two of you in your presentations, again, I think it's very synthesizing, let's say, like the circle graph that shows the privilege that lots of us have here, and then the different angles to which you can get to that privilege. And the issues that come with not having certain not being in the center for all angles, let's say. I think we try to respond to all of those things at the same time without ever being perfect. It's just not possible. But we try to organize ourselves and work like this in our projects. To incorporate as much as possible, knowing that, of course you don't control everything, and so there's this limit to what you can do in practice. Like I'm not in policy. I'm in practice. I'm in undertaking acts. Within our society, you have to work together with existing engineers who might not think the same as you, with other material producers, with contractors, and so on. So you come into contact with a whole range of people who might not be on the same page as you. And we try in an open mind and with lots of empathy also. We try to pull everybody, we call it in Dutch, iedereen het bad intrekken. We pull everybody into the bath of trying to set up these kind of projects in a different way, and hopefully also with different outcomes in terms of processes and in terms of materials being used, emissions being done, and lessons learned for everybody that was involved. So I think that's maybe a first entry into the conversation from the practice, in fact.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I think that's to kind of also locate this kind of interaction further. I think it is I've got Max's book in front of me, and there's in the second half you move towards, again, you describe it as not necessarily a plan or a blueprint, but a list of ideas based on priority areas, so transport, healthcare, infrastructure, urban planning, and then also planning and construction. And within that is sort of the vision of eco-socialist future that you are sort of describing. And when I got to this section, I was underlining quite a lot of it, because it is essentially what you guys are doing, but also a lot of the practices that we've tried to highlight in the exhibition as well. So things like kind of redefining what density means, distributing cities so that it's no longer along specific points, nodes or particular overwhelming areas. You also say density can occur on a human scale. This is something that we see, something that's being adopted more as we kind of think about new ways of building and landscaping. Retrofitting, local materials, essentially bioregionalism, and then interacting with landscape, and more importantly, and also thinking about material production to local material use and construction. And that's something that I know that BC does quite a lot of. And I was just wondering, within that purview or framework, do you find, how is it that, obviously you kind of hinted at it there, when you talk to different stakeholders, engineers, and you've done quite a lot of work for the public sector too, where or how are you finding those sort of points of friction, and how do you deal with the existing incentives to keep building in the way that we are?
Yeah, so when I was reading a little bit into the book also, I was touched for myself within my own. If I was thinking to apply it to what I'm doing with BC, I was kind of touched or reflecting on the fact, like, am I being pragmatic, or am I being radical? Like, am I really doing things differently, or am I kind of still making sometimes pragmatic choices? And so I think there's a tension there that I don't know yet. So sometimes you come into these moments of friction, like, of course, like in collaboration it happens like that. There's people who are not on the same page with you, and so how do you deal with that? How can you get the furthest in these moments of friction? Is it by really forcing through a radical approach, or is it by trying to create an atmosphere of exchange and empathy, and sometimes compromise on some approaches, some materials, some choices, and so on? And so I cannot say I cannot say that we would be 100% proponents of a people's new Green Deal, even though we would like to be, because there's no fixed answer or no ready answer for these moments of friction of how far do you want to go and when can you not overstep this line because it becomes business as usual. You know, like this is a very difficult decision or a consciousness that we're struggling with all the time. The same thing with, like, we are a cooperative. A cooperative is still a business. You cannot organize differently than being a business to be active in the society. And so in our mission statutes, it's written that we aim for impact and so on, and so everybody is clear on that. But still, at the end of the year, you need to earn money. Everybody is looking. Also, all of our collaborators are also like very concerned about how much they earn, which is also very normal. So this kind of calculating, this kind of accountancy, individual accountancy, everybody is still making, and that's maybe the feeling that capitalism is never gone, and that it's very difficult to. Everybody here earns a wage, earns a living. Everybody is calculating for his or herself what's in it for his or herself, and so that these kind of things also enter our practice, and that's also one of those points where it's difficult to know, are we radical enough to be a proponent of something, for example, like a People's New Green Deal, or is it business as usual? You know, like
yeah. Okay, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. So, are there any questions in the audience about anything we've heard so far? Yeah.
We did something wrong. Okay.
It's always the first question's the most difficult to get.
Yeah, thanks for all these contributions. I think I would most like to hear the response of I'm sorry, I forgot your name, the civil servant.
Rosemarie.
Yeah, Rosemarie.
Rosemarie
But
van Ham.
if other people want to kind of give their account, I would also be interested. But I mean, you are working in an interesting political environment, of course. I think something like what you presented, this is maybe my prejudgment, but would be easier to do in a municipality like Nijmegen or Amsterdam or and much harder to do here politically, I would expect. And also now, especially, I mean, it has been terrible for a very long time, but of course the national government has gone completely insane now. Mm-hmm. So what has been the response to the kind of work that you've been doing, and because it's surprising to me, at least, that it's so very overtly political. I mean, I'm not trying to say that you are super radical. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but compared to the politics of Rotterdam, and especially of the Dutch state, it's I mean, you are going into a different direction. So I'm eager to hear about that.
True. What we did was looking at our law, what is the existing law that or the policy that we have for climate adaptation, but also on the social side. And what we did the last 4 years was a lot of awareness. So in their programs and in their policy, we call it in Dutch haakjes maken. So we had made some hooks. So we put our name in the policy. We put, okay, let's make an intersectional climate approach. And then the politics signed it. So now what we can say, yeah, but it happened. So the thing is, what we did now, if we do something, then we can say it's in the policy. So we have space now, but also we have a lot of trust based on the Rotterdam Weather Rights Program. They say we have politician targets, we have to do some things, but we believe in this climate justice because it's important for every citizen in Rotterdam. We give you some money, some hours to do some research. We trust you in that way, and then we can evolve together. So in that way, we have got some trust from some civil servants. But also, the thing is, even the right politicians, they, for example, one of the biggest parties in Rotterdam, they built an locket of houses that have mold. But mold is also a climate justice thing. So you have to look always like what are politicians saying and how can you talk in their language also to... because and the thing is, you cannot be against climate justice, right? Because then it say that you're unjust. I hope I answered your question, but that's how we try to look like to understand your own policy and to look how can you improve it for the Rotterdammers. Yeah, so a lot of reading, a lot of understanding. If we go to the poverty department, we read the whole policy of poverty. Then we're checking like, okay, this is important for climate justice. Then we go to them, we give a presentation, but also to help them. Here, you can change policy things. And what they are saying, like, you are the first department that comes to us and say, hey, we're going to help you, instead of, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. Because we are saying we have a capacity and we have hours to do it. And then to work together. And then in that way, we try to create this movement inside. Yeah.
It's really exciting. We've got a question.
I'm curious, how big is your group? Are you gaining power?
I mean... What is the word of power, first of all? I think we are now inside of the municipality with 3 people, so that's not a lot, but we have, I think, the whole team, because we're working a lot with organizations outside of the municipality who are in the outer ring of the wheel. I think we would, looking at the colleague, 12 persons maybe, something like that. Yeah. And still standing, so that's good.
That's important. We've got someone in the middle.
For Max, I'll try to do it like this. Sure. Thanks. Hi, my name is Lucy from AF Advisors, and I have a question for Max. What your thoughts are about economic debt that you mentioned? How it will come into practice? Is it something that we can think of like the International Climate Fund, or is it or do you think of it a very different way?
I think at the current moment, ecological debt is, I think it's a mechanism, both a political and a rhetorical mechanism in world climate negotiations to relink the environment and development. So if you go back to when like the ecology became a major issue on the world stage with like international dialogues between governments and so forth, it was the 1972 Stockholm Conference, right, and the human environment. And basically, there was an attempt by the first world to basically state that ecological concerns, or what they were calling ecological concerns, should override the right of southern countries to development, right? And the reasons for that were cynical, of course, but what's important is that basically the third world countries were very successful in linking climate and development, ecology and environment and development, and stating that there should be no, that the urge to protect the environment should not come at the expense of development prospects for the third world, a lot of which were fundamentally, a lot of which would actually resolve the third world's ecological problems, to take like problems of pollutants running into aquifers, riverbeds, and so forth, right? This is because of inadequate sanitation, this is because of poverty, or cutting down forests for fuel, this is because there's not enough energy infrastructure, right? To take two of the more manifest examples that you find a lot in the third world ecological development literature of the 1970s and the 1980s. I think climate debt was kind of first there, before the climate debt, there was like this notion of ecological debt, which was then kind of narrowed to climate debt. I view it as, again, a push which came from very distinct forces originally in the third world, right? First it came from kind of like right-wing Colombian, the Colombian president at the time in like the late 80s. Then it came from the NGO forums leading up to the Rio conference in 1992, and then it came from Fidel Castro, who was like, sure, like we'll fix the environment and you fix your economic system by getting rid of capitalism, right? So it's like, okay, this is how we'll agree. And it was meant to kind of there was this offensive again by the first world to essentially de-link climate and the environment and development, and say, okay, now the environment is a worldwide concern, right? This was the recurrent line of division between the G77 throughout the 2000 climate talks, even until 2000, even now, and the developed world, the G77, the third world countries basically, where they affirmed that the environment as the whole and the climate problem in particular imposed common but differentiated responsibilities. This was the line of the third world, right? Common, people needed to do something within their national borders. Fair, differentiated, different people not only had different power to do things, but different responsibilities to do things, right? This then radicalized, I'm sorry for this long answer, but I feel like it needed this long answer to make sense to my answer to your question. Then I think the climate debt was really a radicalization of that, stating that the differentiated responsibilities, that is the responsibilities that were different to different parties, included that the North actually didn't just need to do something in their borders, but they needed to give their resources to the South, right? Because Northern development was actually based on looting the South, right? Which I'm putting in polemical terms, but this is actually like very well established, right? There's actually great work on what's called the colonial drain from what became Indonesia into this country, right? Which is a huge source of its wealth, right? That was looted from the huge archipelago of Indonesia. So there's like, I don't know how many people you have, I'm sorry, like 2 million people or like 1 million, I don't know, not that many. There's a big disparity. You guys did like that 17, joke. 17, okay, well, I'm not a mathematician, okay, obviously. So the point is that it was meant to push back upon that, right? And this is how I see it. It's not going to to implement it would be like to overthrow the whole world system, right? So I don't see it, the call, which I support, like I think we should continue to support it. We can say, and it should be something people campaign for in the North, to pay the climate debt, and then the South to enter the civil society convenings, and the Southern government should be like, pay us climate debt, and maybe some funds will be paid out, right? And maybe if there's like transformed social systems in the North, God willing, we'll see them, then there would also be capital transfers and free technology transfers and so forth, like given in a spirit of kind of human equality and sisterhood and brotherhood. Like, I think such things are possible, but, right now the climate debt, like, when Venezuela and Cuba and Sudan are like to the US and the EU, you owe us like billions and trillions in climate debt, like, that's not going into a fund that is going to be filled adequately and then used for the betterment of third world societies. It's more like a political claim, like how, if it's a world in which it could be implemented, that's like a whole nother world, and I don't know what it looks like, to be honest.
So in that sense, what would we be working towards in that instance? Would it be working towards a version of that, or are we working towards a completely transformed world wherein that's a possibility?
I think it's a way of raising the fact that you need a transformed world and raising people's awareness of it, and also challenging the northern frame around climate and development, which is part of maintaining the world as it is.
Okay.
But I think it's not impossible that some countries in the north could break before other countries, and then they could be interested in real climate and real climate reparations, right? I think that's possible too, and then in which case the mechanism for it would have to be determined. I mean, I think the current mechanisms are not in great shape generally. So I think it would probably be a new mechanism.
Yeah. Okay. We go there and then we go to you after.
I don't know where you want.
I saw the hand in the middle go up first.
So thank you. I have a question for Max. You've given us your vision of how you think that, what kind of policies should be implemented. But then, just a few seconds ago, I looked at the banner with the theme of the evening, hope. So my question is, are you hopeful about this?
Oh, sure.
You are?
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Yeah.
Like 100%.
And then could you tell me why? Because to be honest, if I listen to your story, and I think that I do not agree on everything, but a lot of things do make sense. But I think like this is never going to happen, man. But
well, I'm hopeful because I think it should happen, and I think hope is a useful psychological mindset. If something should happen, then if I'm hopeful about it happening, that we just do the right things, it's more likely that it's going to happen. It's also like a good North Star when you engage in political action, including agitation, including education, including everything, to be like, oh, this could work. Like, I don't think it's very helpful, frankly, to be like, oh, this isn't going to work. Like, no, I'm going to do this, but it's not going to happen. Like, imagine I come out here and tell you guys that. I'd be like, I'd have to check myself. I'd be like, this is a crazy thing to do. Why would I do that? Yeah. But I am optimistic, like, because I think the world is filled with like famine and people getting like white phosphorus and sea level rises and droughts and so forth. And so I think it's necessary that the world not be that way. And so therefore I find it good to be hopeful that that this world is not a permanent state of being.
Ken, I believe you wanted to.
Yeah, I just when you zoom out, when I listen to like these conversations, it creates a feeling of zooming out, and then you see the vastness of the challenges ahead or something, and I have exactly the same feeling as you. However, I think when you zoom in and are busy with something and invest yourself, like in that sphere, in your daily acts that you do, the knowledge that you build up, the experience, the network that you make. There, if I zoom in on my world of the construction sector in Belgium, I have hope. So I think it's also a matter of where your zoom is, and I think to be able to be daily active, I think you need to choose which sector, which topic you are busy with, and then sometimes it's good to zoom out and exchange and see again the system and the workings. But we have to be confident that there's politicians, who in their daily life zoom in on their political decisions. There's builders, there's nurses, there's doctors, and for me that's maybe where the hope is. Like we have to trust that there's other people doing the same in their daily life, and this will create little alliances, little bonds that can push you further. To give you a little example, from my own daily life, like work, activity life, let's say, we couldn't do what we wanted to do. We couldn't use excavated earth in Belgium and use it for unfired, just like that, unaltered, use it as building materials. By law, it was just not possible, it was illegal. And so the Brussels regional government, which is an autonomous sovereign government, welcome to Belgium, it's a small government, where we have a president and we have ministers and so on. And so, we sat down with the minister and some people of the cabinet, and they said, let's just make a contract. It was 2 pages. Let's just make a contract between you and me, between your company and our institution, and we allow you to do that. So these are alliances. These are bondgenoten. How you say it? Allies. These are allies. And then 2 years later, the law was changed in Brussels so that we then were legal. So there's people everywhere who in their daily activities try with their experience, with their knowledge, with their network and so on, with their ideas, who try to bring these changes. And I think maybe that's where we can be hopeful. That's like concrete, like a concrete hope, how you call it, realistic hope or something. Yeah.
I think it's also important to acknowledge. I think that is an important point to say.
But when I think of climate change and then it has a connection with Palestine, then I think like, oh man, that's difficult. But that's just the argument about scale is, I think, very important about what you have an influence on and what not.
But also, I mean, in the book, Max does lay out some genuinely quite exciting not promises, I don't want to put that on you, but ideas around like what does this eco-socialism look like. He described the healthcare one, but actually he goes into quite a lot of really interesting ideas around what does it look like when you move away from thinking about these things as commodities. What does it look like when you have healthcare access as not a commodity? What does it look like when you can really rethink the way we understand cities and urban planning and architecture? So I think, Ken, your example is perfect because what it does is that actually, yes, it's good to zoom out, and even though it can be depressing, my read of it is that actually, if everyone works away, it's like a cliff is a cliff until enough waves wear it down, which I think is hopeful. I mean, it takes a long time, but I think it's work worth doing. We had one question over there.
Hi. My question is for Max. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see, like how China maps onto the north-south dichotomy in the sense that China, as you were saying, is not a country that historically owes the reparations, but it is also a country that is driving a lot of the renewable investment. And so do you see this as constituting more of like a south-south technology transfer, or does it create new dependencies? Does it also make the sort of south-north dichotomy untenable in certain respects? I was wondering if you could expand a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. That's a super important question. So, it's very clear that, like you just said, that China is by far, even now, leading in renewables, and it will probably be leading even more so in the next 5 years, right? It's far ahead of it reaches its own renewable goals far ahead of time. I think it seems clear to me that if the remainder of the third world has to choose who to either import or to try to, if it's able to mobilize politically to engage in some form of technology transfer with, it's better to do it with China than with America or the EU. I mean, the terms that China drives on international markets for finance, for all sorts of things, are just less onerous than the terms that the US and the EU drive, which is not to say that China is engaging in kind of munificent development projects in the third world, but it doesn't impose the same conditionalities in all sorts of agreements. It doesn't also engage in aggressive warfare when countries in the South do things it doesn't like and so forth. I think it's a better trading partner. But a trading partner, it means there have to be two sides, and so there has to be a push from Africa and from Latin America to kind of either to get the technology on favorable terms so that they can scale up that don't lead to continued profit extraction, and in that way carry out their own renewables transition, right? Like I said, I think China is a much more favorable prospect for that, than the U.S. But I think the energy has to come from the remainder of the third world. It has to come from South Asia. It has to come from the Arab region. It has to come from Africa, which overlaps with the Arab region. It has to come from Latin America and so forth, which means that the governments have to have political strength and social power behind them to enter into, to push China to engage in some form of beneficial role. Now, I think, I think it's tricky how we categorize China. I mean, it's clear that either one, China is going to take over the historical US role as the economic center of the world system, or there's going to be a huge nuclear war, right? Like, that's the only way you're going to stop China. I'm being serious. Like, there's no way to stop China, right? It's a huge country which has had, in many levels, a very successful developmental experience over the last 70 years. And it's endogenized, that is, it's incorporated a huge amount of technology. It's moving up the value chain. Salaries there are going up rapidly. It's creating an internal market, so forth, right? Things we know. China is rising. And again, the only way to stop it would be like a crazy amount of violence, which would end everything. So that's happening. Now, I think what that means is then we'll be in a different world than the world we're in now. I don't think, by the way, that this world we're in now is going to end peacefully, unfortunately. Like, my country is not like known for being peaceful, like accepting losses peacefully. So I think that will change things. But I think, and I'm sorry if I'm kind of putting something in behind your question that wasn't there. I think there's a separate question maybe about how we conceive of China's relationship with the rest of the third world right now. I think it's clear that China itself continues to be exploited by the North, right? Like, the multinational corporations are heavily invested in China and extract a lot of value from the North. So China is extracting value from Latin America, from Africa, from Vietnam, for example, and then a great deal of that value then goes on, the profits, and go on and flow to northern, particularly American corporations, right? So America is indirectly still exploiting a lot of these countries that China is in trade relations with through China, while China is also building up all of its own kind of productive plants. So for this reason, I don't think it helps us, if we want to understand the world, to say that China, for example, is an imperialist country. But I also think it's important to be clear that China is engaged in unequal trade relationships with Africa and a lot of Asia, right? That both of those things can be true, keeping in mind that for me, like, imperialism is not reducible to an unequal trade relationship, right? It's more complicated than that. It means political violence. It also means being at the top of the food chain in the world's socioeconomic system. So I hope that kind of answered both your direct question and what was behind it, if I understood correctly.
Great. Thank you for that question, and thank you, Max. I think we're going to have to close out there. So if anyone has any questions, we're going to be around, so you can, I'll speak for myself, I don't want to speak for these guys, but you can approach us at the bar afterwards if any of you would like to stick around. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to Max, Rosemarie and Ken for joining us in this wonderful discussion tonight. I hope this leaves you all inspired and energized. I mean, I feel that way, so I'll speak for myself. Yeah, thank you.
Microphone.
So I have a few pieces of housekeeping. Is that what that is?
Microphone.
So, just as a reminder, the Nature of Hope exhibition will be open in Gallery 0 here at the new institute. At the new institute until the 13th of October. So make sure you check it out. And I think, again, speaking of things that I think are inspiring, genuinely having a look around there, seeing some of the stuff that's already happening and the potential for it. It does really make a difference. Hope is in the name for a reason. But until then, there's also a very exciting parallel program being run by the IABR. So it's going to be taking place all over Rotterdam, so not just here in the new institute. So check out the IABR website, iabr.nl, and you'll find that. And you can also sign up to the newsletter if you want sort of weekly updates about what's going on. And I have a couple of updates from the Dépendance as well. Those of you who have been to a Dépendance event will probably know this bit, but if you've not done so yet, you can check out the podcast. We record our events and put them out as podcasts to share with a wider audience. So if this is your first time joining us, or you've missed the previous event that you were really excited about, don't fret. We're on a bit of a time delay with it, but don't worry. Just it might take a minute, but we're working on it. But we've got conversations already up with authors and thinkers like Nicole Hannah-Jones, Jason Hickel, who is actually a really good reference for this conversation, and Kim Stanley Robinson, to name a few. And then next, I like this. We've got more talks coming in this season. So on the 18th of September, we'll be hosting Didier Eribon, author of A Woman of the People, to talk about class, shame, and the future of the left. On the 14th of October, we'll be joined by Cynthia Miller-Idris, author of the new book, Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right, to discuss how tomorrow's far-right nationalists are being recruited in surprising places and in surprising ways. On the 28th of October, we will be hosting acclaimed economist and journalist Grace Blakely to talk about her new book, Vulture Capitalism, to discuss many of our modern crises, how many of our modern crises are not a side effect, but rather an intended effect of a capitalist system. I'll be moderating that one, just to let you know. Lastly, if you want to be kept up to date with any of our future talks and new podcast episodes, be sure to sign up to our newsletter. Is there a QR code? Yes, there is. And you can use the QR code here to sign up. Anyway, thank you all for attending tonight. Like I said, we'll be at the bar. I think the bar closes at 11, so if anyone wants to keep going, again, subject to their own energy levels, but I think I've got a bit more energy. So, and also, copies of Max's book will be on sale. I think we have a slide. Yes, even better. It'll be on sale by NIE, so make sure you grab a copy. Thank you, everyone, and thank you guys for taking part.